Welcome to We Can Be,
the podcast of the Heinz Endowments,
where we work to build
an exemplary,
sustainable region
where everyone
prospers
and belongs.
Now to the stunning announcement locally that made national news as the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette announced it will be shutting down for good.
Post-Gazette to publish final edition and cease operations May 3rd. Does that mean just the print edition or the whole darn thing?
Can't be the whole darn thing.
Founded in the late 1700s, the Post-Gazette has cemented itself as one of the nation's papers of record, chronicling the Steel City's biggest wins and darkest days.
Welcome to We Can Be. I'm your host, Chris DeCardy. If you've read, watched, or listened to the news in the past few weeks, one of the things you've heard a lot about is the news. From the citizen journalists with cell phones in Minneapolis to the loss of legacy newspapers like our very own Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the future of the news is on everyone's mind. Our guest today is Dr. Andrew Conte. Andy knows the power of investigative journalism through his past reporting for the Cincinnati Post and the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review. He's at the forefront of the future of journalism as the founding director and current managing director at Point Park University's Center for Media Innovation. Since its founding in 2015, the center has become a national leader in supporting local journalism by advancing technology, training, and collaboration between both longtime reporters and student journalists. Andy was named Point Park University's Teacher of the Year in 2024 and honored with the Disruption Award by the Public Relations Society of America in 2025 for his work in ensuring PR professionals have access to trusted journalism and storytelling. He is the author of Death of the Daily News, How Citizen Gatekeepers Can Save Local Journalism, and we are honored to have him here as our guest today. Andy Conte, welcome to We Can Be.
Thanks for having me on.
You've been an investigative reporter, longtime journalist, and for quite a while now have thought about the future of journalism through your perch at Point Park University. When you first heard the announced closure of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, what went through your mind?
Oh, it's finally here. We've been preparing for this moment for a long time. The Center for Media Innovation at Point Park that I run is a laboratory for figuring out what the present and future of local news is in southwestern Pennsylvania. We started it, it'll be 10 years in the September of this year. And we've been planning for this moment, for a crisis in local news. And it's been a slowly unwinding crisis for the last 10 years plus. Even though the news outlets, they still come out. You still get the Post-Gazette. Of course, when we started, you got it every day. And you also got the Trib. You could get it every day. And now, we've seen that slowly erode with the Trib publishing daily, but only in the suburbs. And now, not doing that any longer, only publishing several days a week in the suburbs. And then the Post-Gazette was publishing every day, and now they only publish on Thursdays and Sundays. But then there's also been an erosion within that, far, far fewer journalists who are actually doing the work. And so we've been working at the center to try and fill those gaps, come up with creative solutions. Some of them have worked really well, like the Pittsburgh Media Partnership that brings together 30-plus news outlets from across 10 counties of southwestern Pennsylvania for collaborative reporting, networking, training. We have now 30-plus news outlets across 10 counties that are part of that collaboration. On the other hand, we've tried some things that we're like, oh, okay, let's put that in a box. But the key is to just keep trying things.
What is the crisis and what has been happening over the last couple of decades with journalism in this country?
So several things have been happening with journalism, right? The big thing is that the financial model changed. Print journalism through the 20th century was hugely successful from a financial perspective. That's why you have families like the Block family that made a lot of money from media products. That whole dynamic changed, and people stopped wanting the printed newspaper delivered. They wanted to get the news first on the computer, and then when smartphones came out in 2007, that really changed the dynamic because people wanted to get the news right on their phone. Subsequent to that even is that social media has taken a big part of it. So there's a disconnect between the people who create local news and the people who make money off of it. So on one hand, you've got local news outlets that are creating this content, but then you've got companies like Meta and Google that are taking that content and they're monetizing it, and that money's not trickling down to the people who are actually doing the work. And so you've had a confluence of challenges where people have changed their behavior and the economics have changed, and it's just made it difficult to maintain the old model.
Yeah, so that model's broken, and our eyeballs have been siphoned off somewhere else that is not necessarily connected to what would have traditionally been thought of as news, but is more entertainment information of a different kind. So that has been separated. Why is it important to have that other part that we call news? Why is that a good thing for society?
Well, one, I would say news does have to be entertaining, right? That's one of the things we've found now. Before, when we just had the printed product, you could have a story in the paper and you'd be like, oh, it's going out to all these subscribers and all these people are going to see it. And you didn't really know if they were or not. But now, you can actually track the eyeballs and you're like, this is how many people actually saw that story and this is how many people stayed on the page and read it all the way through it. But the key part of what journalists do is that they hold power to account and they speak up for people without a voice. What was interesting, in my book, Death of the Daily News, it follows what happened in the city of McKeesport down the river here from Pittsburgh, or up the river, either way. But it's along the river. But what happened, when the newspaper there closed, the local politicians were like, this is great. Nobody's going to be asking us questions anymore. They're not going to be looking over our shoulders. But then within a few months, they realized, oh, yeah, but there's also not anyone there to talk about when we bring in one of those giant checks that we've done something for the community or all the work we've done to tear down a building or, whatever happens in the community, nobody's telling those stories. And so ultimately what breaks down when news outlets shrink and then go away is the social capital, the connectivity among people in a community. And to me, that's what's most interesting about local news now is how it knits people together. And when it diminishes, those connections get frayed.
There's been a lot of studies about when regular daily news goes away in a community, that issues around corruption go up in government or in business. The broader point you make, though, about social capital seems so important in this. Ultimately, we are human beings in 3 dimensions, and we live in places. And we do still, even today, in this hyper-connected global world where you can find out information about anywhere in a heartbeat, that is unique. So what is it about local communities that is the most interesting to make sure stays in local news, that creates that social capital?
There are the pieces, the accountability pieces, asking the public officials about, why are you raising taxes or who did you award the garbage contract to? Those are important. But what's also as important is the stories about what's going on at the local school or the kids' sports. One of my favorite parts about the book was that I asked a lot of people that I interviewed, what was the first time you were in the newspaper? And people almost always immediately remember, like, the first time they were in the paper, or there were athletes who said, like, oh, yeah, my mom clipped out every story and it's in a box that I still have underneath my bed.
I hadn't thought about this in forever, but you just said that. The first time I was in the newspaper, I was a crossing guard at my school in 4th grade, and they spelled my last name wrong, and I was just like, heartbroken from all of that. But I hadn't thought about that in forever. So the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, what is that, 1786 we're talking about? Continually publishing. You've been involved in a lot of conversations about what should happen next, and you talk a lot about citizen journalism. Why don't we start with your point of view, what you talked about in the book and what you're trying to do in your work right now? So talk a little bit about the center and your focus. What are you learning and what's important to you?
Anytime a news outlet announces it's going away, there's the immediate response of what can be done to save the news outlet. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's the right question for us to be asking. The question really is, how can we ensure that people across southwestern Pennsylvania continue to have easy access to local news and information, regardless of the platform? At the Center for Media Innovation, what we really focus on are a couple of things that support that. One is this idea that news outlets are better off if they collaborate. I had worked at the Tribune-Review for many years, and it was a stated mission of the Trib at that point to put the Post-Gazette out of business. If the Post-Gazette had closed 20 years ago, there probably would have been champagne bottles popping across town. But because of the collaboration that happens now, we've had for the past 5 years plus, the Tribune-Review and the Post-Gazette, they sit around the same table along with the 30 other news outlets. And so there's an awareness and an empathy there. And so when the Post-Gazette announced it was closing, nobody was happy about it. That's devastating for all of us. And so that's been a real change of focus, has been getting news outlets to say, yeah, we're still going to compete for stories, scoops, eyeballs, dollars, but there's also a place for us to work together. I used the Ben Franklin quote that if we don't hang together, we'll surely hang alone. And people bought into that.
What kind of collaboration are you seeing right now that is inspiring to you in that way?
So the first time that it really got my attention that this was working was when the Fern Hollow Bridge collapsed. Within a half hour of the collapse, Jim Buses, who's the publisher of the Jewish Chronicle, he reached out to me and he's like, I live near the bridge. I'm here. I've got photos of it. We're not going to really use them at the Chronicle. Do you mind if I share them with the other news outlets? And I was like, yeah, that'd be amazing. So he offered up his photos. We shared them out. The photos ended up running in McKees Rocks and a couple other places. And then the news outlets also in that moment started sharing, reporters who were on the ground saying, well, I found this person who saw, heard the bridge collapse or lived nearby. And people started sharing that information. They were still doing their own individual stories, but they were shortcutting some of the competitiveness that would have existed before.
So collaboration is a key piece. What else are you learning and is important to you about the center in your work right now?
So you sort of alluded to it earlier, the idea of the citizen aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
For so long, the news business, especially during the 20th century, before the internet, was a one-directional communication, right? Walter Cronkite would tell America what the news was.
And that's the way it is.
And that's the way it is. And who was going to question it? And a lot of people were left out of that messaging, right? Because there were only certain voices, and it was at a time when to be a publisher, you had to have enough money to be able to buy ink by the barrel. And they always said, like, don't get in a fight with somebody who buys ink by the barrel, right? And when you see those barrels of ink, you're like, oh, I get it. Like, it's gigantic, and you had to have a printing press. And if you wanted to be a broadcaster, you had to have a license and an antenna and all the equipment. All that is broken down. All of us have that ability now with us. Incidents have been taking place in Minneapolis with the ICE raids that it's only because everyone's carrying around a camera with them now, a video camera on their phone, that we have footage of what's actually happening. Thank God we do, right? How do we as news outlets, as journalists, harness some of that energy then? That if people are out there and they're contributing to stories, they're telling their own stories from their own perspective, how can we as journalists work with the public to tell a richer, fuller story of what's going on across all of southwestern Pennsylvania?
So give an example of that. What are you trying out and what are you learning?
We did a pilot project at the Center for Media Innovation where we worked with the Tribune-Review, and they identified people in their community. They just put out an ad, and they said, like, who wants to be a citizen reporter? And people responded to it. There were a lot of people who were like, yeah, I want to do this work. I'm interested in my community. I just don't know how to do it. And so we did it was 9 2-week courses, and people went as a cohort through the courses, and they learned how to cover a meeting, how to read a meeting agenda, how to do interviews, how to create art for their stories. So at the end, they got a certificate. The idea was then that these were certified citizen reporters who then went to work. What we've found since then is that, yes, people want to do that kind of training. They want to be part of their community. They don't necessarily want or have the ability to pay for that kind of training. And so we're looking at new ways of how to incorporate the public. We hold an event each year. We've done it 2 years now, Newsapalooza. The idea is to get the public thinking about the role of local news. It's been a challenge, because people are used to this model where the news publishers are making money, and so if that model is broken, well, it's up for them to figure it out. Since this crisis has happened with first City Paper, so we haven't even talked about that, but the announcement that City Paper, the alt weekly, was closing on New Year's Eve, and then within 2 weeks, the Post-Gazette, we got the announcement that it's going to close in May. That's got people sitting up in their chairs and paying attention, right? And so how do we take advantage of this moment to say, if we want to live in healthy communities, people need easy access to local news and information. And to have that, it requires not just journalists, but also the public. We have to work together.
Right before the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette announcement by a couple of weeks was the City Paper. Were they related in your mind? And what's the impact of two of these happening so close together?
So both City Paper and the Post-Gazette, both owned by Block Communications, same family. Yeah, it was like the first shoe and then the second shoe. City Paper felt like a gut punch. Just the way it was announced, too, that the employees found out on the morning of New Year's Eve, and then they had to tell the rest of the employees, and it just sort of leaked out. And so that was really devastating. City Paper had a unique voice in this community that, is going away. And I will say the one frustrating thing was that there were a lot of people who felt nostalgic about City Paper after the announcement that it was closing. I remember City Paper when I was in college. I remember, this and that and the other thing about it. the city paper contract really wasn't, they weren't asking for much, right? They were like, it's a free paper, pick up the paper, look through it, throw it away, maybe go to one of the advertisers and thank them for putting in an ad. And people couldn't even do that.
Is there something unique about these two news outlets related to unions and labor and how much we're going to pay reporters to gather news?
The labor strife at the Post-Gazette, it's the elephant in the room with this whole issue of the newspaper closing. And it hasn't really gotten that much attention. You know, they were on strike for more than 3 years. Yeah. Their only hope was to get a favorable ruling from the federal government. They finally got the ruling, and Block Communications was clear about this, that if they didn't get a ruling in their favor, they were going to close the paper. So, you know, within hours, minutes of the announcement that the ruling went against Block Communications, they announced they were closing the paper. I do think that's one of the challenges here with journalism in general. Like, how do we ensure that the people who are creating the content that we're hopefully consuming, or that at least keeps our communities healthy and functioning, that they're paid enough to have a living wage and that they can survive on it.
Yeah, so tie it to what we were just talking about. So if you've got citizens playing a part in this, sort of a networked effect, what is the model where people get paid for their work, and who gets paid in that structure?
We figured it out. No, that's the thing. Like, if somebody had figured it out, it'd be easy, right? There are just lots of different models and lots of different strategies for it. I do think there are some that are outliers. One is the Philadelphia Inquirer, where you've got this foundation, the Lenfest Foundation, that owns the newspaper, and it offsets the newspaper's losses. You've got the Baltimore Banner and the Daily Memphian. These are online-only digital products that tell a broad story about the community, and that they've built up digital subscribers so that they're self-sustaining themselves. I think the one right here in our backyard that people really don't know much about is the Tribune-Review. The Trib has a large endowment that Dick Scaife, whether people loved him or hated him, he left them with a position where they are able to use the monies in their endowment to help offset their losses. And it's also allowed them to experiment and do things in different ways. Even in this moment where we're talking about what's been lost, I think there's also an opportunity for us to talk about what could possibly be gained.
So in the work you've been doing in training of citizen journalists, one of the things in my hometown newspaper growing up in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, the Champaign-Urbana News-Gazette, is that you would open the paper and there would be a news section and there would be an editorial section. And I'm interested in what this future looks like, and do these things get blended together, or if there is still a news coverage piece and then there's a separate part with the opinion about the news, how or who decides what that is in the models that you're talking about?
In Pittsburgh, the ecosystem used to be that we had these two printed daily newspapers. The Post-Gazette was the liberal newspaper, and the Trib was the conservative newspaper. That continued until the Tribune-Review's publisher, Dick Scaife, died in 2014. At that point, the Trib sort of realized after that, like, well, we could continue down that path, but that is alienating half the potential audience. And so they've taken a perspective now where they just reflect the conversations that are happening in the community. And the Post-Gazette, for a while, went a little bit Trumpy, and then has also kind of just held a place out for intellectual conversations about the community. That whole idea of what is a paper of record. Paper of record is a place where people in the community can have conversations about issues that affect all of our daily lives. In that sense, those news organizations and most news organizations at the local level are realizing they don't have to be as astringent in their political views to reach their audience.
An editorial slant for a news outlet can come from the editorial pages, but can also come from what you decide to cover, and a little bit from the person who is covering it. The notion of objective journalism has always been an issue and a challenge. And so maybe talk a little bit more about that aspect of what is news in this emerging world that you're seeing coming.
Well, this is the challenge of news, right, is that we talk about it as objective, that reporters are supposed to be objective. They're not supposed to have a personal perspective. But the role of journalists really has been to whatever your personal feelings are, set that aside and go try to tell the story as accurately and objectively as you can. But to your point, there are always subjective decisions within that. What stories do we cover? How do we tell those stories? What voices do we lift up in those stories? What facts do we include? And as we've become a much more fractured society with the internet and people being able to get their news anywhere and not just trusting the voice of authority of someone like a Walter Cronkite, people started raising questions about that. Well, this journalist seems like they have a particular bent, and if you put all these things together, you can start to see where the journalist is coming from. And people would also put their own perspectives onto whatever they thought you were about. When I was a journalist for the Tribune-Review, a lot of people assumed that I shared the editorial perspective of the newspaper. And I would say, well, I'm just an objective reporter. But they were like, no, your paper is this, and you must be that. Then really people had no idea what my own personal perspective was. And so to me, that was always like, if you could tell a story and you got complaints from all sides, then you were like, oh, okay, I must be pretty close to the
right,
objective.
Everybody's mad at me, right?
Yeah.
When I was growing up, if I wanted to go somewhere to find an opinion about the news, there are very few places in my hometown where I could find that. Newspaper was one, maybe a radio station. My goodness, today we can find any opinion we want about anything in any kind of way every second of the day. And so what's interesting about that is that something that was sort of precious and limited, where you could be a gatekeeper 40 plus years ago, is almost the exact opposite. And the precious thing is actually the news, the information upon which opinion is based, especially at the local level. Is there something to that? Or
well, even when you were growing up, all those opinions were out there, right? You just had to go to the barber shop or the butcher shop or the church or the synagogue.
That's right.
And now every one of those people has the platform that they carry around in their pocket, and they're willing to share it on social media. And that's where it gets this cacophony of noises. In the book, I talk about the Huffington Post, and the original model was anybody could post anything. And then after a few years, they were like, oh my God, this is terrible. Like, there are too many voices and it doesn't make any sense. That's sort of where we are now with social media, right? There are just so many different voices. And the challenge is that people come in with their own biases and their own perspectives, and what's relevant to one person might not be relevant to the whole community.
Yeah. I also think I feel overwhelmed. There's a part of me now, it's like, I realize I can go digging around and find all sorts of stuff, but there's so much stuff out there, it's exhausting to figure it out. And I yearn for somebody to be an editor, to just give me some guidance about what to go take a look at.
It's that gatekeeper role, right? And then the challenge with the gatekeeper role, though, is that you only get the news that the gatekeeper thinks you should get, and you only hear the voices that the gatekeeper thinks are relevant. I think that's where we're getting into different fractured communities, because we're aligning with our own gatekeepers and only hearing the news that we want to hear.
Why did you decide to become a journalist?
I was going to go to law school. I was at pre-law, and I started working for the school paper at Dickinson College, and I enjoyed the influence that newspapers have, that you could highlight things that were important to students that the administration wasn't necessarily caring about. You could ask questions of anyone in the administration to hold them accountable to, whatever was important to the students. And then I spent a semester in Washington, D.C. with the columnist Jack Anderson.
Sure.
I don't remember Jack.
Yeah.
He called himself the Mormon muckraker. He came from a long line of people who were holding the federal government accountable by asking questions that others weren't doing. When I worked for Jack, he was syndicated in hundreds of newspapers across the country, and he had a requirement for us that we couldn't pick up any press releases. We couldn't go to any press conferences. We had to ask questions of people. We had to talk to people to figure out what was really going on, and then build our stories around that. And that's really stayed with me the whole time, that idea that it's not about what the public officials want you to carry out. It's about what you as a curious, forward-thinking person can figure out about these conversations that are taking place. To me, that's what's been missing from local news. Just the creative thinking and the questioning, because news outlets are trying to get as many clicks as they can. They're trying to turn out stories quickly. And there's less of the just asking the off-book questions. I'd like to see us get back to that.
Were you good at asking the hard question? Were you good at the pointed one?
Yeah. I mean, that's the hard part, is asking
completely.
the hard questions. Yeah, right.
I grew up watching on TV Watergate and the Vietnam War. And I was pretty young. I was like, that's clearly so important.
Right.
And it just stuck with me that being a news reporter seemed awesome. You could be deeply curious, you could find out as much stuff as you wanted, and you could have a chance to change the world. You could be Woodward or Bernstein in this mix.
Those were my heroes, right? The ones who had held the Nixon administration accountable, and then, all the things that came after that, the Reagan administration around Contra, just Carter with the, drug policy and just all those things.
Yeah, right.
That was important to me. And that's been the other interesting thing that I'm seeing now as an educator, because I'm at the university, I also teach journalism. And I feel like this current generation of young people is the most engaged and interested that I've seen since that Watergate era. There's been a long period where young people drifted and sort of lost touch with why do we do journalism. But these young people and I'm talking about first-year students, second-year students, they want to lift up those voices. They want to ask questions. They want to hold power to account. They want their communities to be better places because of their work. The challenge for those of us who are older, their instructors and endowments and public policy, is how do we create careers for them? How do we ensure that they can do this as their life's vocation? Because they hear the calling, but how do we ensure that they have a way to answer it?
Trump's Justice Department has brought criminal charges against 9 people after an anti-ICE protest at a St. Paul church last month. People charged include former CNN anchor Don Lemon and longtime multiple Emmy Award-winning Minnesota journalist Georgia Fort. Both Lemon and Fort were just there covering the protest. Ms. Fort joins us live now. I know you have a good lawyer. Do you have any help with your legal fees?
Folks have been going to my website and making contributions there, but not just to the legal fund. Folks are wanting to support my ability to continue telling the stories. Journalism is not a crime. And for me, when I think about the attack that we're currently seeing on the press, I really want American people to understand attacking the press is not simply just attacking journalists. It's attacking the public's right to know. So often there are things that have happened with government agencies, people in power, big institutions, and they sometimes may cover up their misdeeds. It is the act of journalists and journalism that oftentimes reveals those truths.
I'm also interested in your take about the safe space to practice journalism. If you think about, like, Woodward and Bernstein were my heroes, and they put a lot at risk to cover a lot of those stories. But the heroes, if you think about in Minneapolis right now, is what if we had had no cell phone footage from so much that is going on? And increasingly, the courage of people to hold up a phone. Or you've got reporters that are covering something and now getting arrested, like we saw in Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. What's your take on what's happening now, especially when citizen journalism, like, does everybody get to say, I've got a press pass? That gets confusing. So how do you sort through that?
I talk about the Peter Parker principle in Spider-Man, that with great power comes great responsibility, and I think that's what we're dealing with now. And the public is still just discovering what power it has in these smartphones. That's the other thing about this generation, that the first and second year college students, they're the ones that grew up with smartphones from the cradle, and they're very adept at how to use that to tell their own story. As we become more aware of what power comes with that, I think people will start to take it more responsibly. We've gone through a period of people were just handed this technology, and we've sort of been using it naively. And hopefully over time, we're going to become better stewards of this power that we have.
So you mentioned the inspiration of the young people that you get the chance to work with. Do you have a story? Do you have somebody that's done something really cool that you love?
We hire about 10 interns each summer, and we place them throughout the ecosystem. One of our reporters during the trial for the synagogue massacre, her name is Abby Hakus. We had placed her with the Jewish Chronicle, and she was working with them covering the trial. And she was like, I don't believe in the death penalty. I'm not sure I can cover this fairly. We talked her through it, and and she realized, and she said, even though I feel this way, I'm setting that aside. I'm just telling the stories as they are, and it was like, yeah, you're doing the right thing. You're treating this as you should. Just tell the story of what's happening. So she graduated from Chatham University, and She didn't think she was going to work in journalism, but we've started through the Pittsburgh Media Partnership, we have a teaching newsroom. And so we were able to offer her a position. And so she joined us, and she sent this lovely note when we hired her. She said, I just didn't think I was going to get a job anywhere in this, that I love journalism so much, and I love Pittsburgh. I don't want to leave Pittsburgh. I didn't think I would find a job. And she started working for us, and she started breaking these big stories. She had one about the state lottery. When they started a $50 scratch-off. That was her story. She broke that story. The Allegheny National Forest, there was all this increased logging happening up there. And I said, how did you even find that story? Because I have the same rules from my journalist. You can't pick up a press release. You can't go to a press conference. And she was like, well, I was reading through executive orders, and I saw something interesting, and I pieced it together. I was like, who does that, right? But she made a name for herself to the point where publishers were coming to us and saying, like, she's doing a great job. And so she ended up getting a job offer to go be the editor at the Latrobe Bulletin. So she's there now. She's running her own newsroom. That's the thing. If we can create those pathways and create opportunities for young people to go into this and make a name for themselves, get a job, to be able to support themselves, then it's working.
I think you posted recently online that it never gets old to help a student get their first byline.
That's right.
And that joy you have in teaching that interaction comes out, which is cool.
Thank you. Yeah, I taught a class in the fall where I had 12 students, and I think 10 of them sold their stories, and it was great. They were so excited about it. You just see how their confidence level comes through whenever they see their byline, and then when they get a paycheck for it. You know, some of the publishers were like, oh, we can only pay, $75 or something. And it's like, no, you don't understand. Like, that means everything to the student, that their work was so good that somebody published it and paid them for it. That's something they'll remember for the rest of their lives.
That's cool. So the name of this podcast is We Can Be. If you think about our community, country, and the world, and you look forward through this moment of chaos in the media landscape, what do you think we can be?
I think we can be better connected by each of us taking more accountability for how we consume news and how we share news. And if we do all those things together as a community, we'll ensure that people here in southwestern Pennsylvania have easy access to local news and information.
Well, Andy, it's been a delight to have this conversation, and one thing I know is that you and your team are playing a key part in helping us get through to that solution, and we appreciate that you care so deeply about this community and the future of news. I'm excited to turn to Matt Barron, who leads our civic participation strategy at the Heinz Endowments, because Matt's been thinking about local news and its role in civil society for the better part of 10 years. Matt, welcome.
Thanks, Chris.
Why is journalism important to our broader history of caring about civic institutions and the role they play in our society?
In our civic participation program at the Heinz Endowments, we really focus on what we call everyday democracy. So those interactions between your neighbor, between a librarian, a local government official, those little interactions that happen every day that are about kind of flexing those civic muscles, seeing a problem on your street, knowing who to call to fix that problem. Local journalism and community news, it affords people the foundation to be able to understand what's happening in their community, in their region, in their country, and to see how they fit into that, how their family fits into that, to be able to hold those with power accountable when there are problems. And it connects all of us, that we're all in this together, that we face common problems, and that by working together, we can see solutions to those problems.
So obviously we talked with Andy at the beginning here. In our community, the announced closure of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette is a huge, important manifestation of what's been a trend for quite a long time. What from the conversation with Andy stood out for you as a really promising pathway for rebuilding that local trust with and through journalism?
So the anecdote Andy shared about when he was a reporter at the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review about 20 years ago, he said, if this news had happened then, the Tribune-Review would have been celebrating. That is so different today than it would have been 20 years ago. You saw the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review put out a statement saying how sad they were. That move from a sense of competitiveness to a sense that we have to work together is a really significant change in this sector and many sectors across our society. And I think what's really exciting about the work that the Point Park Center for Media Innovation does is they live that collaboration. A collection of over 30 news outlets in 10 counties across our region, sitting at a table together, engaging in collaborative reporting, sharing strategies, opening up the hood of their finances, talking with each other about, innovative new business models that could work. It's a very different situation than we had 10, 20 years ago. And I think it exemplifies the fact that the way out of this crisis is not to preserve or prop up the Post-Gazette or any one media outlet. It's to find ways that collaboration and that ecosystem building can improve outputs for all of us.
So Andy's organization plays a unique role in that collaborative ecosystem. From your vantage point, what else is happening in that ecosystem that is interesting and important right now?
What we have right now with this kind of diverse ecosystem of news outlets in our region, some nonprofit, some for-profit, there's a lot of testing and innovation going on right now, given all the disruption that is already happening, that we see coming down the pike. And I think people are really open to trying new things, to exploring different business models, to continuing to kind of break down the walls of who gets considered a journalist and what it means to report the news. In all of that disruption and innovation, we're seeing some green shoots of interesting ideas that are bubbling up that could have promise. And I think one of the significant roles of philanthropy, especially place-based philanthropy like ours, is to nurture some of those tests and to provide startup capital in some senses to try new things and to spearhead that innovation. And if it looks like it's working, then maybe we invest more.
That centralized to decentralized model, if you think about rebuilding faith in civic institutions, how do you see that as a promising part of that broader strategy that we're trying to help in that very localized way?
There are some really positive things that come from that decentralization. You get communities that have often felt like their voices are not heard, that no one listens to them, that they're not given the access to capital and the opportunities that would allow their stories to be told in, a print newspaper or on an evening news show. Now those gates are gone. They're able to grab their smartphone and go out on a street corner and report whatever they want to report. That's fantastic. That's diversifying who gets to tell the news, who gets to decide what's important. But on the other hand, there's still some things about traditional journalism that matter. Ethics, for example, having a agreed upon set of ethical standards that are upheld by editors and folks that do fact checking. And with the decentralized model, a lot of that is gone. Yeah. And so when we talk about trust, that's a really important piece of this story. Because, while I think the proliferation of, YouTube and social media journalists and influencers who talk about the news is really interesting, and there's, that's leading to a diversification of voices in the system. At the same time, those influencers may be receiving money from interested parties that they're talking about, whether those are corporations, even foreign governments. There's no guarantee that they're going to disclose that. And in fact, many of them don't. Yeah. And we have to figure out some way that even in this decentralized model, we can bring some of what was good about that historic system into this new model, because we're not going to rebuild trust if you have all of these citizen journalists out there who we can't actually fully trust what they're saying because we don't know who's funding them, who's paying for them, who may be giving them gifts on the side. And so we have to grapple with that.
Yeah. So my take from Andy through all of this, clear-eyed, concerned, but optimistic about what a future could look like. What's your take?
I share that optimism in a lot of ways. The past 2 weeks since the news came out about the planned closure of the Post-Gazette, I've been in probably 15 meetings with interested parties, whether they're existing news outlets, people from out of town who have ideas, you name it. And what that has shown me is that we do not lack ideas, that there are some really good ideas about there about how we can fill these gaps, how this loss becomes an opportunity to think differently about how we gather news, how we disseminate news. So I'm optimistic that this region will find a path out that still leaves people with really good access to really high quality news. It's probably not going to look like a daily print newspaper, and honestly, that's okay. There's no one way that people get their news anymore. It has changed dramatically, and so recreating an old model is not going to lead to the results we want. The world has changed, and this field needs to change too. And why I'm optimistic is that we already have a really diverse array of news outlets that are working every day, journalists working every day in this region to deliver news, and that's not going to change.
For me, one of the most optimistic things from Andy was this next generation of journalists and of leaders in caring about news and information in their communities. You've got young people now, for better or worse, who have been broadcasters their entire lives because of social media, and unfortunately because of a lot of pressure on that. But they are so talented at communicating and so talented at exploring different ways of doing that. That's a lot to work with. And Andy talking about these young people that care deeply is what left me optimistic. Good to talk to you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Matt, for being here. Thanks for what you do on behalf of the endowments in our community. And thank all of you for listening and for caring about that community and what it can be in the future.